Hi, grade fives. Welcome back to another read aloud for Lemony Snicket's File Under 13 Suspicious Incidents. I will post the solution for Chapter 5 under the Chapter 5 quiz. And I will go ahead today with Chapter 6. So I guess after this we have 7 more incidents. This one is called Silver Spoon. I was in my favorite seat in the library, but it wasn't helping me like the book any better. It was a book people kept putting in my hands and telling me I was going to love, the way the doctor tells you the needle won't hurt a bit. The book began the way it always began before I gave up on it, with a man carrying around a drawing of a snake that had just eaten and asking people what they thought of it. I thought it was no way to start up a conversation. "I hate to interrupt," Dashiell Qwerty said to me, which is a better way. "It's quite all right," I said, to Stained by the Sea's only librarian. "I thought you wouldn't mind," Qwerty said. "You were scowling pretty hard at that book. Everyone else seems to like it, so I thought I'd give it another try. Perhaps I can suggest a better way to occupy your time." "I'm still not sure I'm ready for that book about the woman who falls asleep and kills a horse." "That's not what I was suggesting. Some library patrons need some assistance, and I thought you might be able to help." "Why me?" "Because I understand you're good at assisting people," Qwerty said, "and because it's closing time and you might not have anything better to do." I looked out through one of the library's drafty windows. I hadn't noticed it was so late. The sky was dark blue twilight, pretty to look at but lonely to walk under. Qwerty was right. I didn't have anything better to do. I put the book back on the shelf and waited for Qwerty to turn off the lights and give the room one last look before he locked up, and I followed him out into the quiet streets of town. We walked across the scraggly lawn, where the ruins of an old statue lay sad and cold in the evening air. Qwerty rattled his fingers against it as we walked by. The librarian was the sort of librarian who didn't look like a librarian. His hair was an unusual kind of unusual, a ragged, angular mess that he must have thought was stylish, and he always wore a leather jacket with bits of metal stuck here and there. But he was very much a librarian like other librarians, because I knew I could trust him. Even so, I paused for a moment when, after several silent blocks, he stopped at a large gaping hole in a chain-link fence. Behind the fence, I could see some unhealthy-looking shrubs, peppered with litter and pressed up against the fence as though trying to escape. "Where are we going?" I asked. "I told you," Qwerty said. "Some of my patrons need help." "And they live here?" "At the present, they live in a small camp on the outskirts of town." "At present?" "That means right now." "I know what it means. Where do they live the rest of the time?" "Wherever they can find shelter," Qwerty said. "They're a group of people who move from town to town." "So they're not citizens of Stained by the Sea?" I said. "They're visitors and readers," Qwerty said, "like you." He stepped through the fence and I followed. The wind picked up paper bags and old candy wrappers and whirled them around my legs as we walked through the rustling landscape. Qwerty was right. I was a visitor in town. I did not know how long I would stay, and each day seemed to uncover another mysterious event in a town full of them. Stained by the Sea was the sort of place where secrets lurked everywhere, like shuddering plants behind a fence I'd never thought twice about. Qwerty was also right about my being a reader, and I'd read here and there about people who lived as Qwerty had described. Drifters, some people called them. There were other words, too. The sun left the sky slowly, leaving pale, hovering streaks above us, and before long we were at a small grove of trees that looked shady. Shady is a word which means giving shade. It is also a word which means ever so slightly sinister. I followed Qwerty into the grove, stepping over roots and ducking under branches that stretched out like spooky handshakes. At last we reached the drifters' camp, which was little more than a few tents pitched on dirt that had been trampled flat. There was a small circle of stones where a fire cast its warm red glow onto the faces of perhaps 10 people, huddled in blankets together around the flames. They were mostly men, looking tired and dirty, although there were at least 2 women, and I could see a dog lying close to the fire with one eye open and one ear missing. "Qwerty," said the man with the longest beard. "Welcome. Do you want soup? Who's your companion?" "This is Lemony Snicket," Qwerty said, "and soup would be nice." "Nice to know you, Snicket," said the bearded man. "Have a seat. Are you going to read to us, Qwerty?" "I hope so," said one of the women, whose voice was hoarse and perhaps just exhausted. "Last night you stopped at the part where the bookcase fell on him." "Last night," Qwerty said, sitting on a log and motioning me to join him, "you were telling me about some trouble that Randall had got himself into." "He didn't get himself into trouble," said the woman. "Trouble came and found him, and it arrived by limousine." "Let Randall tell the story," the bearded man said, and the drifters turned their eyes to a short, meek figure who sat on the ground next to the dog. He was a man a little younger and a little cleaner than the others, wearing a pair of glasses that were slightly askew, a word which here means crooked and should be repaired. He looked at us nervously and patted the dog with one gloved hand. "That's a handsome dog, Randall," Qwerty said gently. Randall smiled. "He's not handsome," he said, "but he's my best friend in the world and one of the dearest things in my life." "What's his name?" I asked, "and what's the trouble?" "His name is Ashbury," Randall said, "and the trouble is that one of my other dearest things was stolen from me." "What was stolen?" I asked, thinking of all the things that had gone missing and stained by the sea. It was as if the entire town were sinking into quicksand, item by item, never to be seen again. "A silver spoon," Randall said, "engraved with the letter R. It was a gift from my grandfather when I was born." He sighed and looked at the crackling fire for a moment. "I've lost everything else from my old life, but I've managed to hold on to my grandfather's gift. Until yesterday." "What happened yesterday?" "Smog-faced Wiley stole his spoon is what happened," said one of the drifters. "He's a low-down scoundrel in high-priced clothing." "The Wileys," Qwerty explained to me, "are a wealthy family who own businesses all over the area, from lumber to tube socks. Smogface is the only Wiley left in town. Smogface isn't his given name, as you might have guessed, but it's what everyone calls him because it is because of his habit of smoking cigarillos." "They smell terrible," the bearded drifter said, "but something tells me that man would smell terrible anyway." The drifters muttered in agreement, and Randall patted Ashbury glumly. "Wiley drove past me a few days ago," he continued, "and saw me using the spoon to eat a can of peaches and light syrup." "Were you here at the camp?" I asked. "No," Randall said. "I was working in town. I'm a poet by trade, but lately I've done a lot of window washing. Dicey's department store had me wash their windows for a few coins and some canned goods they had lying around. Ashbury stayed behind to guard the camp as usual. Nobody hires a window washer who brings his dog around." "Same with lizards," said another man by the fire. "Smogface had his driver stop and rolled down the limousine window to ask me about the spoon. He wanted it for himself and kept offering me things. He offered me a carton of cigarillos, but I don't smoke. He offered me his pinky ring, but I don't have no use for one. He offered me a ride in his limousine and a hot bath at his mansion. I was tempted, but I still had windows to wash." "Why did he want that spoon so much?" I asked. "He said he had a collection," Randall said, "but I think he just wanted to see me eat canned peaches with my hands." The bearded man shook his head in disgust and handed Qwerty and me a steaming mug of soup. The mugs had the name of a hardware store I'd never heard of, along with an image of an octopus holding a bunch of tools. The store was gone now, probably. The soup was very hot and very thin, more like earthy tea than soup. I didn't like sipping it, so I asked another question. "What happened yesterday?" I said. "Yesterday, we all went to harvest mushrooms out by Blotted Boulevard," Randall said. "Armadale over there is good at spotting the edible ones. When we returned to camp after sundown, Ashbury was barking like crazy. The spoon was gone, and there was an extinguished cigarillo smoking by the fire." "Did you ask Wiley about it?" "Of course I did," Randall said. "I went right to his mansion last night." We all wanted to go with him, said the woman, but Randall insisted on going alone. The mansion is that big building over on Nib Court with a big brass walrus out front. It's a nice enough place, but nobody was nice to me there. Wiley wouldn't even see me. He had some servant throw me out on my ear. Qwerty told me he knew someone who'd retrieved a stolen object from the Salis mansion. He thought you could help me too. To be polite, I took a sip of soup and tried to think about the Salis mansion instead of the earthy taste in my mouth. There was a much bigger case I was working on, a more complicated one that involved the enormous house the Salis family had once occupied, along with a butler and numerous other servants. I'll go out there tomorrow morning, I said, and see what I can do. I'd be most grateful, Randall said. Any time you need a sonnet, I'm your man. I thanked him and stood up and headed out of the grove with Qwerty. We were quiet all the way back to the Lost Arms, and later that night when I got into my bed on the far east suite, the narrow bed and the dusty room felt much more comfortable than usual as I thought about Randall and the spoon and all the people huddled around the fire. Drifters, tramps, vagabonds, derelicts. So many words for such people, and all of them unflattering. The next day I made my way to the Wiley mansion. It was a bright, quiet morning, and the last of stained-by-the-seas birds fought over a few worms wriggling on the sidewalk. I found the house easily enough. A brass walrus stands out. The driveway was paved with seashells and occupied mostly by a long, black limousine. It was a handsome enough car, but the windows needed washing. In a storybook, the villain lives in a castle and the hero lives in the woods. I had to remind myself this wasn't a storybook. The meek, bespectacled drifter could be the villain, I thought, making up a story about Smogface Wiley just because he has a fancy house and gets driven around in a limousine. A servant answered the doorbell and just stood there, glaring at me, waiting for me to state my business. I stated my name instead and told her I was visiting from the city. She shut the door again. Birds chirped. She came back and let me in. Smogface Wiley was seated at the end of a very long, very polished wood table, as if he had invited a bunch of people to a fancy breakfast and they had all forgotten to come. There were folded napkins and monogrammed silverware at each place setting, but food at only one. Wiley looked about halfway through his breakfast. There was a plate with a half-eaten fried egg and a small pile of roasted potatoes where a large one would have fit. There was a bowl half full of cereal and a basket with half a blueberry muffin. Wiley had a fresh peach in front of him and in his mouth a cigarillo, which is a bit like a cigar and a bit like a cigarette and more than a bit like a smelly nuisance. The smoke from the cigarillo made a small cloud that had for some reason stuck around his nose. Smoky Nose would have been a better nickname, I thought. Good morning, Mr. Wiley. Good morning, Wiley replied and picked up a knife and fork emblazoned with fancy W's. Had I known you were coming, I would have had breakfast prepared for you. Unfortunately, there's only enough for me. That's unfortunate, I said, as Wiley began to cut his peach in half. It's a delight to have a visitor from this city, Wiley said. Stained by the Sea has fewer and fewer well-bred people like ourselves. His fork clattered on the plate, and the peach rolled around a little in the struggle. Well-bred is a word which doesn't mean anything at all, but which some people use to make themselves feel better than others. I watched Wiley fight the peach and thought of myself as well-bred and him as something else. Perhaps you'd like to join me for dinner tonight, Wiley said. My friend Mr. Samsa has taken ill, so you could take his place. I personalize the menu and decorations for each of my guests. It's a very well-bred gathering. I'm sure it is, I told him, and looked down at the long table. You're certainly entertaining a large number of guests. 25, Wiley said with satisfaction. Until recently, I couldn't have had that many. Why is that? Wiley spooned a bit of peach into his mouth with a well-bred spoon. I'm sure you didn't come here to hear about my social life, he said. That's true, I admitted. I'm looking for a lost spoon. Wiley gestured down the table. These are mine. The one I'm looking for isn't, I said. It belongs to a man named Randall, whom I believe you met a few days ago outside Dicey's department store. That's right, Wiley said. I was out shopping for ascots and asked him to move aside so I could admire my reflection in the window. Did he? Did he what? Did he move aside? He did. Did you notice he was eating with a spoon? I noticed he was eating, Wiley said, eating. He was getting light syrup all over himself. Have you seen him since? I have not, Wiley said, with a waggle of his smoky head. My sort of people don't associate with greasy drifters and one-eared dogs. I spent my time entertaining an assortment of well-bred friends. You had another dinner party last night? Yes. Can you prove it? Wiley swallowed his bite of peach and then blew a smoke ring toward my face. Of course, he said. Ask Dr. Auchincloss. Ask Madame Blavatsky. Ask any of the 22 other people on my guest list. If I ask them, will they say you were here all night entertaining them? Wiley's eyes flashed above the cloud of smoke. If you ask them, they will ask you why you are asking. Perhaps it's because I admire your ascot, I said. I'm beginning to think you're not well bred at all, Wiley said. I bet you don't even know what an ascot is. An ascot, I said, is a fancy scarf, and you are a liar. Give it back this instant. You can't talk to me like that, Wiley said, rising from the table. I'll have you thrown out on your ear. You should stop saying that, Smogface, I told him. It's your mistake. Now get me the stolen spoon, or I'll tell all your guests how you acquire your personalized decorations. Interesting. So, I wonder what Lemony has figured out about Smogface. I wonder how a spoon with an R on it would be something he needed for his upcoming dinner party. And why Lemony figured a spoon with an R on it would be useful. I guess you'll share your ideas with me when you answer the questions for this chapter. Thanks very much. See you next time.